Thanks for putting me on the program. I should say, disclaimer at the beginning, I'm not originally an AI person. I probably know less about AI than maybe everybody in the room. But my background is in electronics, supply chains, the digital economy, and so on. And I work at the Federal Reserve Board. And like everybody else, when ChatGPT blew up the world, the policymakers wanted to know what it all meant. And since I'm somehow adjacent to AI, I was encouraged to go into this. So this is sort of the outcome of my digging into this issue over the course of a few months. The paper is up on archive now. It's about 75 pages, so I won't be able to cover everything. Definitely would love comments, feedback from folks. A lot of people in here know more about the technology and more about the economics, too, than I do. So the paper is called Generative AI at the Crossroads, Light Bulb, Dynamo, or Microscope, and the idea behind it is there's a lot of empirical work that's happening, some field testing, some analytical work that suggests whether generative AI is going to have a first-order impact on the economy. But I would characterize that work as sort of green shoots, right? It's not dispositive. And so what we thought we would bring to the table is to talk about what kind of technology is generative AI. What do we know about these classes of technologies and how they affect productivity in the economy? So I'll clarify that I'm going to talk about labor productivity, so the output per hour of workers in the economy. I'm not going to talk about the effects on the job market. That would be another 75 pages. So the classes of technology that we're thinking about are the light bulb, the dynamo, and the microscope as exemplars. Those of you who took macro, the light bulb is sort of your classic solar swan growth model technology. So there's an invention of a light bulb, say. So you think of Thomas Edison going through a bajillion types of filament and settling on whatever it was he came up with so that the light bulb would work. There's a new invention. It's got to spread through the economy, right? Firms have to adopt the technology. And what the solar swan model tells you is that there's a sort of TFP, or total factor productivity impact. The cost of producing lighting has gone way down. And now the price of lighting should as well, right? There's a margin in the middle there, but eventually the price should go down, and firms should adopt this lighting technology, and productivity should go up. But the trick is that productivity level goes up until the technology is fully adopted, and then it stops. Right? So in the transition period, there's an impact on economic growth, but in the absence of something else happening, the productivity growth effect is temporary. The dynamo example, there's a classic paper by Paul David about this. You know, the dynamo is a way of translating mechanical power into electricity, and when that was developed in the late 19th century, it was gradually adopted in factories where it was a much more efficient way of transmitting power than the belt system that they had in many places where the power would be spun off of a leather belt, and there'd be a whole series of belts in the factories organized around this central, prime mover. So with power being generated with a dynamo and transmitted over wire, it's much more efficient. You lose less power in the process, but you can also spread out. Right, so the initial impact of the technology was replace all the belt systems with dynamos, right? So there's productivity gain right there. But then the knock-on effect of that is once these companies were comfortable reorganizing production and rebuilding their factories with this type of energy in mind, you get this additional impact. So there's this massive amount of reorganization that happens. And that's a kind of technology that we call a general purpose technology. So I should clarify at the beginning, a general purpose technology is not just a technology that's widely used. It is in the vernacular, right? But to economists who work in this area, there's three criteria for a technology to be a general purpose technology. It needs to be widely used. It needs to have these knock-on productivity effects, right? So the dynamo-inspired reorganization of the factory, that's a knock-on innovation. And the core technology itself has to get better over time, right? So in a way, you can think of the solo swan productivity effect as there's this target productivity level, but if you keep replacing the light bulb filament with filaments that last longer and longer, that productivity level is going to keep rising, right? Because the cost of light is going to go down. You're going to use light bulbs in a wider and wider array of applications. Okay, so there's a threefold definition for general purpose technologies in this context. Not to say you can't call things GPTs just because lots of people use them. The microscope is an example of what's called an invention in the method of invention. Right? So the microscope, the telescope, and all these other compound, optical inventions were rolled out. Suddenly, you could see things you couldn't see before. Right? So the process of acquiring knowledge became more efficient, and innovation sped up. Okay, so in the classic solo swan model, there's an exogenous forcing function where productivity shocks arrive from some unknown source, right? So in what's called an endogenous growth model, or in many of them, that process is endogenized so that the research sector is actually making a choice in response to incentives about how much to spend on R&D. And the more you spend on R&D, the more innovation you get. So in a situation like that, or in a model like that, an invention in the method of invention is a shift in the R&D production function, right? So that's the kind of thing that could, in principle, raise productivity growth indefinitely, right? So this is the parameter of the solo swan growth model that ultimately determines how fast the economy grows. And the nice thing about the microscope and other IMIs is it makes the economy grow faster because invention is faster, and we're seeing this all over the place with Gen AI, right? So that's what we want to talk about, is like, what is Gen AI, briefly, and then can we argue that it falls into these categories? A little bit about what empirical work there is, some of it by folks here in the room, but mostly a sort of theoretical approach. So motivation, as I said, web searches for AI shot up when ChatGPT came out. We all know adoption went up like crazy, and so this fueled an interest within policy circles, and that's why we wrote this paper. But for us, we want to know about the economic effects. We're well aware there's folks that come in to the board and do sort of dog and pony show and show what all these Gen AI models can do, and it's really cool and impressive. But the question that we care about is, what's the impact on the economy via productivity? So you can picture a world where there's another IT boom coming. There's all kinds of IT innovation out there, similar to the 90s, for those of you who were alive at the time. But I was. But the 90s ended with a collapse, right, in 2001. So what happened there was this massive innovation in fiber optic technology, right, communications equipment. And there was also a network race amongst different providers to deliver these fiber optic services. So if you were alive at the time, you would have seen construction crews coming through and tearing up the streets of Philadelphia over and over again, as one after another of these companies tried to build out the fiber optic network and get to the scale first that would allow them to capture the market. And as you may know, that didn't turn out well. There's this massive capital overhang, in part because it's not just about forecasting the volume of use, and it's not just about this network race. As the technology changes, for a fixed amount of use of fiber optic services, say, you need less capital, right? So one after another, these fiber optic transmitters came out with the different kinds of multiplexing, so that on one fiber you could get an order of magnitude more content delivered per second, every 5 years or so. So everybody overestimated how much they were going to need. And as we know, data center construction right now is going through the roof. And that's, of course, predicated on an assumption about how much people are going to use AI. I don't have an opinion about whether that's the right forecast or not, but it's definitely something we're worried about. So I want to clarify also that our focus is not on AI as a whole. There's tons of work on AI that precedes Gen AI. There's very little work on Gen AI specifically, although you can see a lot of it in the posters in the lobby. The best work on the effects of Gen AI, I would say, is Dan's work with colleagues. We're interested in knowing, what's the additional effect of generative AI beyond all the machine learning that the big IT companies are already using. All right, so this is not about Amazon forecasting demand using machine learning. It's about what else do you get from the generative part. And as I hinted at, we're interested in profitability. We're not interested in technical feasibility for this paper. And we're going to focus on what kind of technology Gen AI seems to be. So here's a picture from the Stanford HAI report you're all probably familiar with. There's these phenomenal increases in performance on all kinds of tasks that you might have thought in the past were not achievable by computers. And that's all great. Lots of things are technically feasible. What we want to know is this kind of performance on these benchmarks cost-effective and practical in a business context? And that's really not clear yet. There's a wide array of data sources out there. There's a bunch of field studies. I didn't list more than a few of them, but all these field studies point to real potential for generative AI, as I'm sure you all know. And there's information from benchmarks, like I just showed you. There's a lot of work on job descriptions from Dan and a lot of other folks. There's surveys of adoption that I'll show you in a minute. There's information in patents and publication records. There's text analysis of company statements. And there's figures on investment, like the data center spending I just showed you. So there are all these things kind of floating around. We try to do is kind of make a broad qualitative assessment of what it all means in the paper. So for us, it's always nice if you can give a number for your forecast, but a number for the sake of a number when you don't really know is a little deceptive. This is just going to be a qualitative paper. I'm not going to take a stand on whether this is going to be, Goldman Sachs says productivity levels are going to go up by 15%. They might be right. We're not going to take a stand on that. I already talked about this with the title slide. There are these different kinds of technology. We're interested in knowing whether generative AI is a GPT or an IMI or both. A quick mention of definitions. As I'm sure most of you have recognized, there's no widely accepted definition of artificial intelligence. In the seminal conference at Dartmouth, they provided some criteria. It needs to solve problems reserved for humans. I think this is what, lay people think AI is, right? It needs to be able to form abstractions and concepts. You can think of, this latent model that neural networks and such develop as falling into that category. It needs to use language. It needs to improve itself. But then you go to the National AI Initiative that was put into law in 2023, and it's kind of the same, but kind of not. We're not going to take a stand on exactly what AI is. There's an appendix in the back of the paper where we are sort of walk through these different definitions and think about them. So I'm already down to 1 minute. I'll just say really quickly, generative AI, to our mind, is generative, but it needs to produce contextually appropriate artifacts using an open-ended stochastic process that draws from patterns in a data set. And we could parse each one of those words, but we won't. Rudimentary generation already existed before ChatGPT. I don't need to tell you guys what it is about ChatGPT that makes it different. It's basically creating from an unbounded set, in a sense, or an open-ended process. And where it's coming from is this algorithmic innovation, but also big data techniques and specialized computing hardware. So I'll just go really quickly through these three criteria. There's a lot of information out there that's seemingly contradictory about diffusion and adoption. The Census Bureau has a survey that surveys a statistical sample of businesses in the United States and finds very low AI use. And then you talk to McKinsey, and they're like, oh, everybody's using it. And of course, these things are both true. Like most businesses in the United States are very small. So the folks who answer the convenience survey from McKinsey are a very different animal, right? I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. We already saw from our guests from Anthropic some examples of knock-on innovation, like the coding extension that they have for their Claude AI system. Their process innovations, like the NVIDIA Isaac Software Development Kit, and their organizational changes, the elimination of middle management, automation of low-level analytical tasks. So it seems to meet the knock-on innovation criterion. Ongoing core innovation, I think, is pretty obvious. We know that algorithms are getting better, the chips are getting better. There is this issue of running out of data that we talk about in the paper. We won't get into that here. I think it's a concern, but not everybody does. And just to touch on this real quickly, we do think it's an invention in the method of invention in a method of invention. We describe 4 different types of these in the paper, and it's a multifaceted IMI. It changes observation, it changes analysis, it changes communication, and the organization of R&D labs. So this is an area where it seems to me it's really clear that good things are coming. I'm going to jump past all of this and just abuse the moderator a little bit more. So we think there's compelling evidence that generative AI is both a GPT and an IMI, but, and I think this is a key takeaway, the forecast has to tell you not just what's going to happen, but when, right? So the path from knowing that this is a GPT and an IMI to a productivity impact can be a long one, right? You think about, if you look at like Bill Nordhaus's work, the price of computing started falling in the 40s, right? The IT boom didn't happen until the 90s. It's also important to keep in mind, this is my last slide, important to keep in mind that we're arguing that Gen AI is going to make a positive contribution to productivity growth, but it's important to know what the counterfactual is. So if it's the case that machine learning, the effect of machine learning on productivity is petering out, Amazon, Facebook, and all these digitally native companies have adopted machine learning. It's not clear that digital transformation at the companies in the neighborhood here is, something that's going to happen. If that's fading while generative AI is coming in, it's not clear that the aggregate productivity growth is going to go up. And then anyway, lots of uncertainty, obviously, in the translation of engineering performance into economic performance, going from the lab to the C-street is a long journey. Right. Thanks very much.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions? Conrad?
Yeah, I'm curious about how you think about the scaling trends. Now, you nicely showed we invest crazy amounts of money into building big data centers. There's the other graph that you didn't show, which is that running GPTs is getting cheaper per year by a factor of 10 or something like that. And even on given hardware, it's getting cheaper and cheaper because the algorithms get better. So I'm wondering if you can kind of put the two of them into like how you see the future evolve in that area.
Yeah, so that's, what you just said is the really encouraging part. It's the algorithms getting better. There's a Neil Thompson paper that shows this. But so a lot of the sort of, MIT, Stanford crowd talk about these scaling laws, right? And that's real. More inputs does get you more output. But from an economics perspective, you want more output for the same inputs, right? You want to see the scaling laws shift. And we are seeing that. That's what the algorithms tell us. So I'm told to wrap it up, but maybe one more question.
Yes. How do you thank you so much for sharing this paper. What are some ways in which you practice this discipline of looking at things as an economist every day? Because it's so easy to be carried away with all the flashy demos, all the investments going in. But how do you train yourself to think as a hardcore economist, really thinking about impact on productivity and make that a part of how you operate every day? Do you have any feedback on that?
You could go to econ grad school. It attracts people who are naturally pessimistic about this. We don't tend to get excited about the stuff that, that the MIT folks do. I think they're both useful, but 400 economists at the Fed, and we keep each other honest.
Thank you very much.